Okay, happy to be welcoming back James Kobielus, the Senior Director of Research for Data Management at TDWI, for his second appearance on Speaking of Data. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. Great to be here, Andrew.
Great. Thank you so much. Today, I think we're going to have a discussion on a topic that is very much in the forefront of most people's minds and perhaps even their fingertips in the last few weeks: ChatGPT and large language models. So I'd love to get right into the nitty gritty, if you will, Jim. So what exactly is ChatGPT?
Yeah, first of all, it's been a buzz since really November, when ChatGPT was released, and people began to use it and talk about it and write about it and obsess over it. And it's still going on as, depending on your point of view, a mania, a fad, the next big thing, the end of the world, or the beginning of a great new world of potential. There's lots of different things, but really breaking it down, ChatGPT is a chatbot, and chatbots are not a new thing. They've been around for a long time. It's software that you input natural language, such as through textual inputs, or spoken inputs for that matter, a chatbot generally. And then it responds with natural language to maybe advise you on what products you should be buying, or whatever. So chatbots have been around for a long time. They've got artificial intelligence at their heart, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, whatever the underlying algorithms might be. So really, ChatGPT is a AI-powered chatbot, and it's purely for automated generation of textual outputs. So there are some chatbots where you'll speak into it or you'll type into it, and those ones, some will generate images. There's some of those on the market. A lot of them are open source. But ChatGPT is a chatbot that's geared to you type in inputs, and then it produces textual outputs, which may be blogs, maybe uh, journalistic articles, it may be program code or what have you. And it automates the generation of those. It's an open, free of charge research preview, ChatGPT. It was invented and it's owned by and run by OpenAI. And OpenAI began in around 2015 as a nonprofit, co-founded by the likes of Sam Altman, Elon Musk, and some other movers and shakers in Silicon Valley and so forth. And a few years later, they spun off a for-profit group under OpenAI that is, among other things, is licensing ChatGPT, one of their inventions. And so it's an open, free of charge research preview. We have to keep that in mind. And it leverages an underlying neural network, machine learning. It's AI, what's called a large language model. Specifically, the large language model is called GPT 3.5, and GPT stands for, brace yourself, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And I'm not going to unpack all of those right now. So it's version 3.5 of GPT, which was invented by OpenAI a few years back. And soon they will have a GPT 4.0 on the market. But rather than go into the guts of that, I'll point out that a large language model, GPT 3.5 being one of them, is just a vast neural network that's trained on textual data, meaning things like social media chatter, the contents of Word documents, really anything that has any data that can be fed into a vast database or data lake. We call it a corpus, CORPUS, of textual data. And then basically GPT 3.5 then is built to look for patterns within textual data sets and roll it up, and to be able to do smart inferencing on that data to do some amazing things like generate, if like with ChatGPT, once again, that's a chatbot. You type in write me a sonnet in the style of William Shakespeare. What it does then is it automatically generates a response, a textual document responding to your prompt. They call it a prompt. Whether it does that well or not well is in the eye of the beholder, but it does that, and it's been doing that a lot of different things, not just that, amazingly well than large language models and chat bots that people have seen up till now. So it's captured a lot of people's imagination. And by the way, it's https://openai.com/blog/chatgpt if you all want to go in and try it out for yourselves. I've gone in. Occasionally you can't get in because it's so popular. But yeah, so ChatGPT essentially is an AI-powered chatbot running on GPT 3.5 that really is more flexible and more powerful and produces a wider range of full fidelity documents that look like they were written by actual human beings, but they were automatically generated by artificial intelligence. So it's very powerful.
Is that power and flexibility and perhaps the fun of using it, the reason why it is, become so popular in your estimation? Just the enjoyment of being able to explore this.
Yeah, and I'll just say, idiosyncratically, I've explored it to write poetry or to see how well it does write poetry. I've said things like, write me a poem in the style of like a Tom Waits lyric. So Tom Waits, the singer-songwriter, who's very idiosyncratic and funky. So we went in and produced something because it had ingested Tom Waits lyrics, and it had a strong sense, the GPT 3.5 for the patterns of lyrics that are characteristic of Tom Waits. So it rolled up lyrics, and I thought, oh, okay, that sort of sounds like Tom Waits if Tom Waits was totally unoriginal and cliche. So my sense as a consumer of the output is like, okay, it's sort of in the ballpark, but nobody's fooling anybody here that Tom Waits wouldn't write something quite this corny and lame. But hey, you're on the road. Maybe the next version or two or three will fool even Tom Waits himself into thinking he wrote these lyrics. But yeah, so yeah, that's one experiment that I've done. Many other people have done other things.
Yeah, it seems to be, at the very least, if you're not going to use it for any sort of professional reasons, something fun to play around with. And it's certainly been used a lot. Like you mentioned, I think millions of people are using it all at once, it seems, because it's frequently unavailable due to overuse.
Right. Oh my gosh.
I think, a good way to move forward is to tie this more closely into the realm that we work in data and analytics. So how would ChatGPT be used in the professional realm?
Yeah, well, first of all, how do we use it generally? It's really simple. You go to a website, the address that I gave, you type in a textual, they call it a prompt, like the one I just said, or write a paragraph about what ChatGPT is about. I literally did that before I spoke on ChatGPT at TDWI Las Vegas last week. And it produced a paragraph, summarizes something it knows really well. You type in your prompt, you hit the carriage return, and voila, await the auto-generated content that responds to your prompt. It's a little bit more elaborate than that in terms of the UI, but not much yet. But nonetheless, within that basic, simple UI, you can do very powerful things. So now, how do data analytics professionals use, how are they experimenting with ChatGPT? Automated code generation. We're seeing this all over the map now, where programmers are going in and directing, writing complex prompts, telling ChatGPT to write, R code or Python code to do various things and so forth. And so we're seeing a fair amount of uptake, at least in terms of experimenting with it for automated code generation. Now, automated code generation, automated by machine learning, has been around for a bunch of years now. Like as an analyst, I've been covering it for some time. So ChatGPT is not the first AI-driven bot to do it, but nonetheless, that's a core thing that it's being used for. But also, what we're seeing now is that enterprise data and analytics professionals are using ChatGPT to be able to generate guidance to their own people, data scientists and data engineers and others, about how to do some fairly complex technical things. Complex in the sense, well, rolling up this guidance by training ChatGPT on all this technical material that, programmers and data scientists, data engineers are expected to read or expected to compile and correlate from various sources, but they're human beings. And sometimes when you're faced with dozens or hundreds or even thousands of source materials that you have to read and get expert on in a hurry, it's like you sort of want to automate this process to the best of your ability. So we're seeing some uptake of ChatGPT basically to roll up technical documentation for human consumption or for the consumption of technical humans who aren't themselves robots who can do it automatically. So yeah.
And something that you touched on a minute ago is in the realm of some people being afraid that something like ChatGPT may, take over the world. I digress. Maybe even just take over their current role or their job. Is that something that is even on the horizon for something like ChatGPT?
Well, that's a big concern in the general popular discussion of not just ChatGPT, of natural language processing and natural language generation, which are the very heart of what ChatGPT and large language models, LLMs for short, do. But let's think about this a second. This has been the sort of dystopian fantasy surrounding AI from the start, meaning Alan Turing's imitation game from 70 years ago. The founder of AI, it was just a thought experiment. If you can build a program that, behind a curtain that talks to a human being and convinces the human being that it's, eloquent enough and flexible enough to actually be a human being. If you can fool a human with a bot, then that intelligence that you built, artificial intelligence, is verging on real, actual intelligence. Now we're able to do that in reality with LLMs and chatbots such as ChatGPT. And oh, by the way, ChatGPT, it has competitors. By the way, ChatGPT has been exclusively licensed to Microsoft, but Google has something called Bard. Baidu out of China has something. There's a lot of different competing bots and LLMs and so forth. So it's not the only one. But what we're getting at is that the whole notion that you can automate what an industry analyst does. I write reports, I do research, what a reporter or a journalist does, that by pressing a button, a student can automate the generation of a term paper to fool their professor into thinking they've been attending class and listening. I mean, now we're verging into things where, yeah, you can do powerful things, but you can also perpetrate powerful frauds. The powerful frauds can be perpetrated in a way that the perpetrator gets off scot-free if we don't watch out. So there's that potential. That it's clear. How do we determine the difference between an LLM generated document and an authentically human authored document on the same topic? There's research going on. Some college students, 20 years old, has come out with some software that he claims can detect the difference between an LLM generated piece of text and a human generated. Whether that works as advertised is another matter altogether. But there's lots of concerns, but also, I think it's an emerging, it'll be an emerging practice under the broader heading of data and analytics governance to have, if you're an enterprise deploying LLMs and chatbots such as ChatGPT for production uses, you're going to need to bake these controls and safeguards into your governance processes, such as maybe require LLMs or chatbots to produce an automated watermark that's maybe not visible to a human, but can be algorithmically visible to other bots to indicate, well, this is produced by a bot. that's one way of going about verifying that something was either, if these watermarks are mandated by, regulators and, laws and so forth around the world, that's one possible futuristic control that will allow us to determine the difference between, algorithmically generated fraud and real human authored documents. But I'm jumping far ahead here. LLMs are really powerful paraphrasing tools if you think about it. If I could take the entire Bible and run it through an LLM and then generate book by book, Old New Testament, really high quality paraphrases. I mean, that actually, just take any source text you want, producing the proverbial, cliff notes of anything that you want and gearing it to particular audiences, gearing it to like, okay, this is a simplified version of the Bible for 8-year-olds. This is a translated version of the Bible for people who are native speakers of Indonesian language or whatever it might be. You can see how powerful this can be, this technology as productivity tools, if used properly. Well,
the next question I was going to ask you, Jim, was to kind of differentiate between ChatGPT and large language models. But I think you've already kind of nailed that on the head for everyone. The distinction should be relatively clear. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on there?
Yeah, let's make this quite clear. So ChatGPT is not a large language model. ChatGPT uses a large language model called GPT 3.5. Before long, OpenAI will come out with GPT 4.0 and beyond and so forth. And so it's like the difference between, in automotive terms, you have the chassis and then you have the engine. Swap out a new engine into that chassis, and you've got essentially a new car, or a car that performs differently and more powerfully, whatever. So basically, GPT 3.5, like large language models in general, basically, the way to think about it, it's a neural network. It's a machine learning model, but it's like autocomplete on steroids. It incorporates, in this case, 175 billion with a B. I feel like Carl Sagan here. 175 billion parameter neural network transformer model. I'll put transformer model in air quotes. This is like a huge neural network. This is like one of the most hugest neural networks on Earth. And it's, in terms, it takes some serious cloud computing power, and to make LLMs like GPT 3.5 do their magic. So what it does, GPT 3.5, and really LLMs generally, it predicts which words statistically come next within the response to a user inputted textual prompt. In other words, write a poem in the style of Shakespeare. With that as the instruction, you can call it programming. It will go then, having GPT 3.5 as commanded through ChatGPT, will go in then and generate an output, because it knows, having been trained on vast amounts of poems of all sorts, vast amounts of English literature of all sorts, the entire corpus of all the Shakespeare's published work, because it has been built and trained on the patterns that are representative of those different styles of textual output. It will then generate the most characteristic output that's consistent with what you've asked for. In other words, it'll produce a perfect cliche if you don't watch out. It'll produce something that's by algorithmic instruction, totally formulaic. That's the purpose of a large language model. It'll produce a formulaic output. In other words, don't expect originality. That's the opposite of what a large language model doing generative AI, which is what this is, generative AI, is supposed to do. So basically, what you'll see is a realistic looking output document that's not only in the rough style of William Shakespeare, maybe from his sonnets, which is only one part of his output, one part of his life. Um, and then it'll produce it in a fashion that's grammatical, syntactically put together and according to standard English syntax, but also semantically, it'll be bang on. There will be nothing, I mean, if the model is trained properly, funny looking about it, in terms of it'll describe things that seem to be real things in the world, the way the world actually works, or at least the world of the imagination of William Shakespeare works, in such a way that you can give it to somebody who's maybe not a Shakespeare scholar, and they might be fooled. It's like, whoa, wait, was this part of Hamlet? So that's actually cool and scary. It's basically deep faking text, which is like the word deep fake I had to throw in here. People, when they hear the word deep fake, the concept has been applied to image outputs of generative AI models. This is just deep faking applied to text now.
That's so interesting, and
Yeah.
I do like the deep fake correlation, because I think that puts an easy identifier on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back into the realm of enterprises and businesses that might be looking to use something like ChatGPT, what sort of challenges do they face? Do enterprises with data and analytics professionals specifically face with large language models?
Yeah, well, we can unpeel the onion here. So large language models, let's stick with LLMs. They're an awesome innovation, and the innovations are accelerating and have been for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Really, just before, I mean, a couple of years before the whole pandemic lockdown period, the Silicon Valley companies like Google and Microsoft, OpenAI and others, DeepMind, started to come out with increasingly powerful approaches to building highly effective LLMs. And over the lockdown period, if you look at all these data scientists and computer scientists who basically locked down inside their apartments and homes everywhere, they just kept on coming out with newer revs to the LLMs that were already out there, but also new approaches like text to image LLMs like DAL-E, for example. Transformer model, I used this term a little while ago. That's the core innovation that's in GPT. It was invented by Google under some approach called BERT, an LLM called BERT, like Bert and Ernie. By the way, Baidu has its own LLM they call Ernie, just to, whatever, it's not Sesame Street. But what I'm getting at is that, so innovations are accelerating at a rapid pace. These are extraordinarily complex artificial intelligence, machine learning models. They're complex as all get up, hard to develop, hard to train, hard to maintain. You're not going to find people off the street in most places in the world who know anything at all about LLMs in practice. I mean, in terms of how to build them, how to make them, how to tune them and train them. So that's, everybody who's getting involved with LLMs in the business world are bootstrapping themselves and having to teach themselves from the get-go. They may be an AI expert, but they're not necessarily an expert on LLMs, which is something entirely new because there's so much innovation going on in the vast AI space. This is one of many types of innovations. They're huge. LLMs are huge. So they've been increasing in size in terms of the number of parameter. And a parameter is simply, it's like a feature in machine learning talk. It's simply an aspect of a task that has been learned algorithmically by a statistical model, which is what machine learning is. So LLM sizes have been increasing 10 by a factor of 10 annually in the sheer size of these models, in the number of parameters that they contain, but also in terms of the amount of CPU and GPU, computing resources and memory and storage and bandwidth. Think about your IT budget being blown out of the water as soon as you get involved with this. And these are huge challenges. So they're hugely resource intensive. This is hugely new as well. There's very few commercial LLM platforms and tools on the market. Microsoft, they're an exclusive licensee of ChatGPT, by the way. I have to remind everybody, they now have an Azure cloud service for ChatGPT. And so we're also seeing Google and others come out with their own respective cloud services and beginning, and tools to help users, developers, data scientists, and others to get up to speed on all this and start to build and productionize useful applications. But this is highly immature as a market, so don't expect things to work as advertised right from the bat. Everybody's kicking the tires, and this is advancing so fast. An investment you make in the year 2023 in all of this might be entirely obsolete in the year 2024 or 2025, the way immature markets work. So a lot of risk committing too soon. As you're an enterprise and you're looking at LLMs, you're in evaluation and exploration mode, and will be for at least a year or two in reality before you're even close to ready to deploying a production application. So like I said, expertise in building and running and managing LLMs in production is scarce or non-existent and quite expensive, and the people who know how to work these things are working for the big, Silicon Valley and also China-based companies that are building this stuff. So it's not like you're necessarily going to be able to pay their price. They're doing some of the most advanced and in-demand work in the world for some seriously high prestige companies. But also the risks associated with LLMs in the world, like in terms of being able to impersonate and plagiarize, but also training these models on data that has been harvested and scraped from across the internet, encroaches on copyrights, lots of copyrights, lots of people who've sweated, authors, I'm an author, who've sweated over their work, are having their work used as the source material for building and training these LLMs that in theory might put them out of work. That's a contentious issue. So that's one of those risks. There's a lot of risks there. A lot of them are legal, a lot of them are regulatory and compliance risks. So keep in mind that this is becoming highly litigious going forward. So LLMs generally, ChatGPT is the most visible and fussed over implementation of LLM-driven chatbots out there right now.
Amazing. I can see that there's going to be a lot to come in this specific area. So you touched on the challenges and some of the risks. I think the next question is about, let's just say you do start to get involved here. What data governance practices are needed to limit those sorts of risks?
Right. Recently, we at TDWI Research, we came out with a best practices study called Responsible Data and Analytics. And I think our listeners should should come to our site and should register and download that particular report, because we provide a framework generally for things like data ethics, but also data quality management, but also things like AI safety and so forth. That's a useful framework for understanding and assessing the various categories of risk that need to be addressed and mitigated when you begin to roll out LLMs. I'll just hit some of the high points, which I've already alluded to or discussed directly in today's podcast. First of all, what you needed to do within your data and analytics governance practices is incorporate strong governance over the training data used to build LLMs and to train them. Because bias. If the textual data you're using is standard human, like social media chatter, for example, and you're building models that you want to be bias free in terms of are not slanted against or disparaging various and sundry demographic, social groups, races, creeds, gender, gender orientation, and so forth. the LLMs are only going to be as biased or unbiased as their training data. Make sure that your training data is as unbiased as you can possibly make it before you build and train an LLM, because your LLM is going to be as racist as your training data. Just keep that in mind. So governance. So you need, then this is unstructured data. You need strong governance, which means you're going to need governance professionals, call them data stewards, specifically tasked with making sure that this training data, this unstructured, multi-structured data, being maintained in whatever data lake or repository you're retaining it in, is always kept in compliance with like privacy, anti-bias, laws and regulations and policies that are in place in your company, within your country or region, in your industry, first and foremost. Secondly, that's the inputs into these models. The outputs from these models, curation is a key thing. You need to have close curation, monitoring, vetting, supervision over the outputs from LLMs, like from the LLM that drives ChatGPT, to make sure that toxic content, racist, sexist, offensive, or whatever, doesn't get out into production, at least not in a production enterprise application, because there's obvious harms and risks from having no controls. You need guardrails, and that really involves human beings who are tasked with making sure that the data, or that the outputs from these models are anodyne is the word that's often used. They're unoffensive and they're compliant. And these curators, to understand what the LLMs are putting, they need to be subject matter experts to a great degree. They can't just be skimming over this content. They've got to understand it at some depth to understand what might be appropriate versus inappropriate for particular audiences or readers or communities to which this content is directed. So this can't be automated entirely. You need human beings to be reading up. Also, you need to establish, getting back to the training data, you need to establish a program of appropriate compensation for the providers of the source content that you used to build and train your LLMs. Depending on, I'm not a lawyer, so depending on what the laws are, or even in anticipation of regulation, think it over, think it very clearly. If you're going to be taking the entire published lyrics of every member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and using that to then train an LLM that generates song lyrics, well, I don't know about you, but I don't want to have Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan's lawyers, everybody else for that matter, breathing down my neck. If you're going to be using their lyrics, so that think about maybe compensating them for that before it's too late. And don't say that Jim didn't tell you so. But also, and last but not least, something I haven't addressed yet, but it's under the broad responsible data analytics umbrella. Machine learning models have a huge carbon footprint in terms of training them. I mean, they use a heck of a lot of compute power and so forth. So we're talking about LLMs are the biggest machine learning models in the world and becoming ever bigger. So of course, they're going to have an ever-growing carbon footprint. As you ramp up, scale up your usage and training of LLMs, keep a close watch on their carbon footprint. With them and with every other piece of the AI ecosystem, look about running those computers that are training them up, those cloud clusters and so forth, on non-renewable energy sources, whether it's wind or solar or whatever. Mitigate the sustainability impact of LLMs for the good of the planet. So really, if you look at so it's like for the good of the planet, mitigate the carbon output from LLMs. For the good of society, you need curation and governance to prevent toxic outputs and so forth. but also just for the good of your enterprise, for your continuing to operate, you need to make sure that, as with all of your other analytic applications, that you can trust that the outputs from these applications like ChatGPT are trustworthy. So it's, once again, this is an evolution of your data and analytics governance practices, or you should incorporate these controls within an evolution to your governance practices. And that's really my takeaway and netting from, for TDWI's community, from what you need to consider now. We don't know, I'm not going to speculate on the things that have been in the press. Will ChatGPT gut Google's search business model? I really don't know. And quite frankly, I'm not going to comment. ChatGPT is being incorporated into Microsoft's Office productivity tools. How is this going to change the nature of office work? Good question. I don't know. I'm going to let other analysts worry about those things. But we at TWI, we focus in research on governance topics. That's one of our predominant mandates, and we've been covering this for years. And clearly, we have now crossed an inflection point into a new era of governance. Where we all go with this as enterprises, how we build this into our existing practices, is an open issue, and we're clearly going to cover this in future reports and conferences. So I thank you for listening today.
Absolutely. That last question sounds like one that I might ask ChatGPT right after we're done here. See what they come up with.
In the future, you're going to be chatting with a deep-faked Jim Kobielus face.
That's right.
And the words out of my mouth will have been deep-faked by, ChatGPT or something else. So in the future, it may look like I'm this current age forever and that I'm stuck on this one theme. Don't blame me. Blame this technology,
Yeah, absolutely.
Immortality, if nothing else,
For sure. Okay. Well, that was a lot of fun, Jim. I really appreciate you taking the time out. I know that we could probably talk for a lot longer on this topic, and perhaps, when 4.0 is released, maybe we'll have you back on to discuss the findings that you have on that one. But
my audience, when you catch me anywhere, just grab me, we'll go out for a beer, and I'll just blather around about this and every other tangent. So yeah.
Terrific. All right. Thanks again, Jim. You have a good rest of your day.
Have a good one.
All right.
Bye.